This is the second, I suppose, in an evolving, I suppose, series called An Elderly Jewish Political Science Professor Does His Thing. I guess this is the second of my videos on the evolving, interesting relation with my college on the over the events of the day, and I'm inclined to call this elderly Jewish political science professor part deux. If you saw the great parody of Rambo in the late 20th century, Hot Shots Part Deux, you understand what I'm referring to. And this is not connected with anything. I'm just reminded of the advertisement for Naked Gun Part 2, I think, or 33 and a third, whatever it was. And it was, if you see one movie this year, you're probably not getting out enough. And if you're watching this video now, you probably have given up your social life to the internet, in which case you probably need more therapy than I do. Let me say something first about the strange mixture of seriousness and humor. And I'm going to give you a little background about my first video. And by the way, you'll see on the same channel, I didn't even know such a thing as a YouTube channel existed more than a couple of weeks ago, so to speak. Or I should say a couple of months ago, because when my college, Converse College in Spartanburg, South Carolina, went online, and as did almost all colleges and universities, and I did my teaching with a mixture of Zoom and video. So I recorded YouTube videos for the first time. And so, and I'm not advertising, by the way, but if you want to see my interesting lectures from constitutional law this last semester or gender and politics, maybe I should back up, and if you didn't watch the first video, again and again and again, like someone addicted to heroin with sugar flavoring, which might seem interesting to me, I don't know. Anyway, so I have to say, those of you who had me in class, who know me as friends or colleagues, or former friends and colleagues, know that I have an odd sense of humor that intrudes itself in reality in all kinds of ways. It's probably true that my friends and family would have a tendency to designate my sense of humor as something more of a chemical imbalance, but I'm the way God put me together. So like many other people in my universe, I refuse to accept responsibility for myself and blame everything on my parents, God, my society, and my beloved dead cat Mordecai. May he rest in peace. So about me in this sense, my character has always been a kind of an odd mixture of seriousness and humor. I may actually in the elderly Jewish science professor, political science professor, part 1000, talk about what a Jewish sense of humor is, what a sense of humor is, and why I think it's both a psychological, a cultural, and even a spiritual necessity. I personally believe that one of the factors in preserving the Jews, in addition to their addiction to doughy pastries, fatty dairy products, and foul-smelling smoked fish. For those of you who are not a member of the tribe, that's, of course, lox and bagels and cream cheese. Anyway, I'm serious about humor in this sense, that humor is an indispensable part of the human condition. When drama came to light in ancient Greece, it's not accidental that it almost instantly resolved itself into two modes, tragedy and comedy. And it's because you could say that when you're not eating and performing either ends of the alimentary canal's functions or whatever human beings like animals have to do to stay alive, then you're probably either laughing or crying or thinking. A religious person would throw praying in there too, and we won't even talk about the erotic dimensions of human life, either as Plato or Freud understands them. But if this strange mixture of humor and seriousness irritates you, then probably, again, you should change the channel. I happen to think, as I said, that humor is a necessary cultural, psychological, spiritual, aspect of the human condition. One of the great debates in the philosophic underpinning discussing, say, tragedy and comedy, say Plato's Symposium, where he discusses this, and from the moment that tragedy and comedy resolved itself into different artistic modes, there's always been this debate within Western art, which is the more profound approach. Is tragedy deeper than comedy? Is comedy deeper than tragedy? And you would think offhand that there's no question about that. You would think, well, comedy is light. It suggests laughter, lack of seriousness. And you would say tragedy doesn't compound the seriousness and brokenness and sadness of life. All it does is simply express it. And one has to say that there's something to be said for that. But on the other hand, if it weren't for Aristophanes and other philosophic commentators on Aristophanes and comedy, one would think that that tragedy had won the contest long ago. But what's the argument briefly for humor? And then we'll get back to our business here, which is, what is part deux of an elderly Jewish political science professor? I'm going to read the second of my letters, open letters to the college, and I'll extend the background to that. So, you almost don't have to to get back to tragedy and comedy for a minute, you don't have to make the serious argument for tragedy because it seems to lay itself out. Tragedy suggests that happiness is impossible in human life because human beings are so broken, so faulted, that, for instance, not only is it a question of utopian societies never being approached or political perfection or something, but even personal happiness. And why? Why does tragedy say we're doomed to unhappiness? Primarily because we don't possess either the knowledge or the power to direct our characters or our fates to our happinesses, and that always some aspect of circumstances that we haven't comprehended and can't master, or some aspect of our characters that we are blind to, the tragic flaw, that kind of thing, will always undermine our capacity to be masters of our fate. Okay, but what's the serious argument for comedy? Well, first of all, maybe life is broken and sad and unhappy. Certainly in Jewish history, there would be enough. 90% of Jewish history is something that you wouldn't want to write home to your mother about. And yet you could say this. If life is essentially broken and tragic in that sense, in the full sense of tragedy, wouldn't we need relief from that? Wouldn't we need somehow occasionally to turn away from the natural tears of human existence and elevate our spirits through laughter? That's the therapeutic argument for comedy. But I think there's a spiritual and a psychological argument for it, and that is in this sense. And we won't go fully into this. Again, this will probably be the elderly Jewish political science professor, part 236. Or since I said part deux, following Hot Shots part deux, I should say part 243, whatever. Oui. The most serious argument for comedy, and by the way, I once taught a course called Tragedy, Comedy, and the Holocaust, because take an example of human history, not only Jewish history, but human history, which would seem to completely be unsuitable for a comic treatment. And to some degree, I have to say, what changed my mind on that, and many people's minds, was a remarkable film by Life is Beautiful by Roberto Benigno, the Italian comic who, and what is Life is Beautiful? It's a comedy based on the Holocaust. If you wanted a perfect tragedy based on the Holocaust, I would recommend Sophie's Choice. And in fact, in my course, we looked at both of those. So what would be the serious argument for comedy given life's potentially foundational, horrific nature? First of all, perhaps it's not essentially horrific and sad. Tragedy may be wrong about that. And it may be that there's more good and more capacity in human beings than the tragic point of view inclines. Strictly speaking, in the Bible, for instance, which is based on a belief in a world engineered by an all-powerful and all-knowing creator who brings the world into life through love, and even if that love and the knowledge and goodness which He created the existing universe is obscured by its brokenness, nevertheless, you would say that if you really believe in God, there's no such thing ultimately as an unhappy ending. Remember, in Jewish history, the slavery in Egypt isn't the end of the story. It's the freedom and the liberation from the slavery. In the Christian story, it's the crucifixion isn't the final part of the story. The resurrection is. And to carry forward, you could say this, in our own lifetime. Auschwitz isn't the final story of the Jewish people in the 20th century. Israel is. And so in some ways, tragedy may show truths about the human condition, but it may not be the final answer. And in this sense, comedy and laughter would not simply be an escape or a medicinal remedy for life's sadness. It would point to the true conquest of goodness and happiness over its impediments. So in that sense, let me say about the psychological benefits. One of the things I've been working through in the last couple of months is a technique of ethical self-transportation called musar, which is the Hebrew word. It's often translated as ethics. And in all versions of Judaism, there's some component of this. It wouldn't surprise you that one description of Judaism is ethical monotheism, which would equally apply to Christianity and Islam. And to some degree, the suggestion is monotheism comes into the world through divine revelation, not only to generate knowledge of the divine, but that knowledge of the divine becomes absorbed and part of the human character, not just in terms of theoretical consciousness, but also ethical transformation. The idea that a human being could know God, truly know God, and try to welcome God into your life, and not somehow be transformed into if God is good, then to know God would mean it's not just like you would know God and then go out and commit murder or thievery. To know God is to wish to become a good human being by increasing the reflection of the divine in one's character. I think that's of course not only under Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It's under Islam and Hinduism and Buddhism and etc. So anyway, to get back to the main point, why would humor be a psychological or cultural necessity? Well, I would say this, especially in these times, it's very easy to become angry about the imperfections of the United States, the nature of our academic life, the hairstyle that Nancy Pelosi wears. I'm just kidding about that. But I mean, let's be clear. Both in the human psyche and in the political and cultural world, it's a lot easier to become angry than it is to become thoughtful. For that matter, it's easier to become angry psychologically than it is to laugh. And I would say this, the whole point of a liberal arts education, and in some ways the perfection of human life, both under revelation and reason and philosophy, is not to dispense with laughter or anger or even crying or weeping, tend to replace it with rationality, but rather to keep the things in our lives and the elements of our psychology that make us angry or sad or happy in the sense of laughter or funny, and overlay them with a rationality that puts them all in perspective and perhaps engineers the kind of happiness that Aristotle speaks of at the beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics. So, in some ways, especially when it comes to the issues of the day that are disturbing our nation, and also the academic world, which led to my first letter, which I'll talk about in a minute, and this one, it's very easy to get angry at the people you disagree with. So if you can keep some element of humor in both your minds, you prevent your anger from turning against you and overwhelming you and turning into unrequited self-righteousness and fury. There's a reason why the Jewish tradition, why the Catholic tradition sees anger as one of the main threats to human happiness. Of all the emotional states, anger is the one that seems to most have reason on its side, and especially righteous anger. And if you think about it, when we're really angry at another human being, we've kind of turned ourselves into Zeus, ready to throw thunderbolts at the mortals who have disappointed us by disagreeing with us. So in some ways, if you can, in the midst of your anger, keep some laughter, you save yourself from being destroyed by your anger and overwhelmed by it, and perhaps you make your opponent, not your enemy, but your opponent, laugh for a minute, and therefore save them from themselves. Humor is probably the most effective way that either God or the human condition has given us to retain our humanity in the midst of all the distractions and sufferings and injustices that perpetuate our universe. So, I'll probably give some people who are listening and watching to this, as I know for sure, who read some of the material I'm about to read, cause to be angry. But perhaps you'll also laugh and recognize that I'm not your enemy, I'm somebody who disagrees with you. And to launch an argument opposing you is not the same thing as assaulting you personally. I think that's something that our educational system has lost track of, as you'll see. Now,